The sun beat down on Redemption Gulch with the fury of a blacksmith's forge, baking the dust on the main street into a fine, choking powder. Silas rode in on his steady mare, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the glare. He was a man made of quiet angles and weathered denim, his movements economical, and his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow in high noon. He dismounted in front of the general store, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. As he tied the reins to the hitching post, a booming voice cut through the afternoon's lazy hum. "Well, look what the dust blew in," Sheriff Brody drawled, leaning back in his chair on the boardwalk, his star gleaming on his chest. "If it ain't the town mute. Cat got your tongue, Silas." A few men loitering nearby chuckled, their laughter dry and mean. Brody was a man who measured his importance by the volume of his voice and the discomfort of others. Silas, with his steadfast silence, was his favorite target. Silas didn't respond. He simply finished his knot and turned, his gaze briefly meeting the sheriff's. There was no fear in his eyes nor anger, just a calm, patient assessment that seemed to unnerve Brody more than any retort would have. Silas's hands, calloused and scarred from years of mending fences and breaking horses, hung loosely at his sides. They were still, but they held a certain potential, like coiled springs waiting for a reason to be released. "Still nothing to say?" Brody pushed himself to his feet, blocking Silas's path to the store. "A man who don't speak ain't got nothing worthwhile in his head, I always say." Silas simply looked past the sheriff, his focus on the door of the general store. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that held no submission. With a quiet step to the side, he moved around the larger man and disappeared into the cool darkness of the store, leaving Sheriff Brody standing in the oppressive heat, the sound of his own hollow laughter echoing in the street. Leaving the suffocating judgment of Redemption Gulch behind, Silas felt the tension in his shoulders ease with every mile the wagon put between him and the town. The open plains of Wyoming were his sanctuary, a vast, quiet expanse that asked nothing of him but honest work. Back at the Henderson Ranch, he moved with a silent, practiced efficiency that old Mr. Henderson had come to value more than a dozen loud-mouthed braggarts. He mended fences with meticulous care, his hands sure and steady, and calmed a spooked mare with a gentle touch and a low murmur, the only voice the animal ever heard from him. As the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, casting long shadows from the Bighorn Mountains, Silas finished his chores. He ate a solitary meal in the bunkhouse, the silence a comfortable blanket. But once true darkness fell, a different kind of duty called to him. He walked far from the ranch house, into a secluded box canyon where the rock walls would swallow the sound. There, under the indifferent gaze of 1,000 stars, the quiet ranch hand vanished. He pulled a well-oiled Colt Peacemaker from its worn leather holster. His eyes, usually downcast and placid, sharpened with an intensity that would have frozen Sheriff Brody in his tracks. Setting 3 small stones atop a weathered stump, he took a deep breath. His body was still, a statue in the moonlight. Then, his hand became a blur. 3 shots exploded in a single, deafening roar. The 3 stones, each no bigger than a silver dollar, vanished into dust. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder, was the only evidence of the violence that had just occurred. A flicker of old pain crossed his face before he holstered the weapon, his secret once again safe in the vast, unforgiving silence of the West. 20 miles east of Redemption Gulch, under a sky bleeding orange and purple, the Miller homestead was an island of tranquility. That peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, chilling presence. Jedediah Kane and his Black Vultures gang emerged from the twilight like specters, their faces hard and cruel. They didn't storm the small farmhouse. They surrounded it, their silence more menacing than any war cry. Elias Miller stepped onto his porch, holding a worn-out shotgun. "State your business," he said, his voice trembling but firm. Kane smiled, a predatory slash in his bearded face. "Your business is concluding, friend. We're here for everything else." The violence was swift and brutal. They broke Elias' arm, not for resisting, but for the sheer sport of it, his cries echoing across the plains as they ransacked his home. They took food, money, and 2 horses, leaving the family terrorized and broken. As Cain mounted his horse, he looked back at the sobbing family. "Tell Sheriff Brody in Redemption Gulch," he drawled, his voice cold as a grave. "The vultures are coming to roost." Hours later, a breathless neighbor burst through the swinging doors of the Redemption Gulch saloon, his face pale with horror. The boisterous room fell silent. "It's the Millers," he gasped. "Attacked by the black vultures, Jed Cain himself." A wave of fear washed over the patrons. The name was poison on the wind, a promise of death. Sheriff Brody, who had been loudly boasting at the bar, slammed his empty glass down. He puffed out his chest, a mask of authority slipping over his unease. "Jed Cain, just another coward preying on farmers," he scoffed. "Let him come. He'll find this town has teeth, and I'm the sharpest one." But his eyes darted nervously toward the door, and the fear he denied was now a palpable thing, clinging to the air in the saloon. Fear settled over Redemption Gulch like a shroud of dust. The usual bustle of the main street was replaced by hushed conversations and anxious glances toward the horizon. Sheriff Brody's loud promises echoed hollowly in the tense air. Inside the saloon, his attempt to form a posse was a miserable failure. He slammed his fist on the bar, his face red with frustration as only a couple of town drunks and a nervous stable boy volunteered. "Cowards, the lot of you," he bellowed to the silent room. Enraged, Brody stormed outside, the batwing doors swinging wildly behind him. He spotted a familiar target of his contempt: Sela's quietly loading sacks of flour onto the Henderson wagon. Here was a chance to reassert his authority. "You, mute!" Brody snarled, striding over. "I'm deputizing you. You'll ride with my posse." He jabbed a finger at Silas's chest. Silas paused, his gaze lifting from his work to meet the sheriff's. The air crackled with tension. For a moment, the town held its breath, watching. Then, with a slow, deliberate finality, Silas shook his head once and turned back to hoisting another sack. The simple, silent dismissal was more insulting to Brody than any spoken word. Humiliated and fuming, the sheriff could only stand there as Silas finished his task, his authority crumbling in the street. Later, inside the general store, Silas listened as a freight driver, his voice low and trembling, recounted what he'd seen at the Miller homestead. They didn't just take things, they broke them, broke him, made his family watch. The word struck Silas like a physical blow. A cold memory surfaced, the smell of smoke, the sound of cruel laughter, a loved one's plea. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. The past he had buried was no longer a distant echo. It was a storm gathering right outside of town. The days that followed Brody's failed posse were suffocating. A thick, dusty haze of fear settled over Redemption Gulch, quieting the usual daytime clamor to nervous whispers and furtive glances. At the Henderson ranch, the tension was just as palpable. Sarah noticed the change in Silas immediately. He was still silent, but his silence had a new weight. His shoulders were tense, and the distant look in his eyes was replaced by a haunted, simmering storm. She'd seen him return from town that day, his face a grim mask, and knew he'd heard the full story of the Miller farm. One evening, as he cleaned the harnesses in the dim light of the barn, she approached him, a cup of steaming coffee in her hand. She didn't speak at first, simply setting it down on a nearby crate. He paused, his hands stilling on the leather, and gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement. "The whole town's holding its breath," Sarah said softly, leaning against a post. "Feels like we're all just waiting for the other shoe to drop." Silas didn't look up, but the rhythmic motion of his hand stopped. "My father talks about leaving," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But this is our home. It just feels hopeless." The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge. Before Silas could even process a response, the frantic ringing of the town bell shattered the evening quiet. They both ran outside to see a lone rider, a hulking man with the black vulture's insignia stitched onto his vest, sitting arrogantly on his horse in the middle of the main street. He laughed at the fearful faces peering from windows. "Jedediah Kane sends his regards." The man boomed. "You've got 3 days to gather $500. A safety tax. Failin' that, he's gonna light this town up like a Christmas candle." The rider spurred his horse, kicking up dust as he galloped away, his laughter echoing like a death knell. Silas watched him go, the terror on Sarah's face mirroring the fear across town. In that moment, the fight within him ceased. The past was no longer something to be buried. It was a weapon to be drawn. Panic curdled the air in the saloon. The Black Vulture scout, a greasy man named Pike, savored the fear, leaning against the bar with a proprietary smirk. Townsfolk argued in hushed, frantic tones. "We have to pay, it's the only way." A merchant pleaded. Sheriff Brody, slick with sweat, just wrung his hands, his badge a meaningless piece of tin. The saloon doors swung open, cutting through the noise with a drawn-out creak. Every head turned. It was Silas. He ignored the stunned faces, his eyes locking onto Pike. The scout's smirk widened into a sneer. "Well, look here. The quiet man. Come to offer up your mule as a down payment?" Silas didn't stop until he was a few feet from the bar, his presence sucking the remaining sound from the room. His expression was as hard and unreadable as granite. He simply raised a hand and pointed a steady finger toward the doors. The command was unspoken but absolute. "Leave." Pike chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "I ain't going nowhere until—" He never finished the sentence. His hand darted for his pistol, but it was a fool's errand. A blur of motion, a flash of steel, and the saloon exploded with the single, deafening report of a gunshot. Pike cried out, stumbling back against the bar, clutching a hand that was now a bloody ruin, his gun clattering uselessly to the floorboards. In the ringing silence, Silas stood unmoved, a faint wisp of smoke curling from his reholstered pistol. The town stared, mouths agape, their fear replaced by utter disbelief. Brody looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Then Silas spoke. His voice was raspy from disuse, yet it carried the weight of a judge's sentence. "Go back to Kane," he said, his gaze boring into the terrified scout. "Tell him Redemption Gulch doesn't pay." News of the scout's humiliation reached Jedediah Kane like a thunderclap. His face, scarred and weathered, twisted into a mask of pure fury. "He did what?" Kane roared, his voice echoing through the camp. "Ride. We burn that town to the ground and hang this Silas from its highest rafter." Back in Redemption Gulch, the air was thick with a mixture of terror and resolve. With Sheriff Brody having fled at the first sign of real danger, the townsfolk looked to the one man who hadn't flinched. Silas, no longer a silent shadow, became their reluctant leader. He moved with quiet efficiency, positioning the handful of brave men, Mr. Henderson among them, behind barrels and in doorways. Sarah, her jaw set with determination, stood beside her father, a rifle held steady in her hands. The thunder of hooves announced the gang's arrival. The Black Vultures stormed down the main street, guns blazing, expecting a terrified populace. Instead, they were met with a disciplined volley of gunfire. The chaotic fight culminated when Kane, enraged, saw Silas emerge from the blacksmith's shop. "You!" Kane bellowed. "Just you and me." The street fell silent, the remaining fighters holding their breath. The two men faced each other under the harsh sun. Kane's hand twitched, reaching for his pistol. But before his fingers could even grip the handle, Silas drew. It wasn't a blur, it was an erasure. One moment, Silas's gun was holstered. The next, it was smoking in his hand. A single, perfect shot rang out. Jedediah Kane crumpled to the dust, his reign of terror ended. The remaining vultures scattered, their leaderless charge broken. As the townsfolk emerged, Mr. Henderson walked over to Silas and placed Brody's discarded star in his hand. "This belongs to you now, Sheriff." Silas looked at the badge, then at Sarah's hopeful smile, and for the first time felt he was truly home.